John Reiff has been with us here now for a full day, so he's one of us and has blended into our group. We'll keep the introduction short and sweet because he's going to bring all this together for us in a most meaningful way. The reason why we invited John to come here from Massachusetts is that he works with and is part of the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education. And just a couple of years ago, Massachusetts undertook, through its very structure, not dissimilar to our own Tennessee Board of Regents, a vision project that created several goals for, I'm sure, what would be defined in Massachusetts as high impact practices, but it's trying to picture a vision beyond just the pedagogies into what are our goals and what is our vision for our entire system. We have been on pins and needles to hear how this has been going in the state of Massachusetts, and John has blessed us with flying here to tell us in person, and then he's going to challenge our administrators as we close up the day.
All right. Thank you, Mary, and I would like to add my thanks to everyone who has put this program together. The places that have sponsored it, the people who have worked behind the scenes to make it happen. This has been a tremendous program, and I feel privileged to have been a part of it. Full disclosure, before moving to Massachusetts in 2000 to take on a role as Director of Service Learning at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, I spent 8 years in Tennessee. I lived in Greenville, and I worked with service learning and civic education at Tusculum College and with colleagues around that part of the state. And so I am delighted to be back in Tennessee having a chance to talk with the group of you. And what I'd like to do is very briefly hit a few touch points for the approach to civic learning and civic engagement that we are working out in Massachusetts. And then I want to give you a somewhat extensive overview of what it is we're actually doing and trying to do. And my hope in doing that is that I might be providing you with some models that you might want to adopt or adapt in places where you're not already doing something like that or something even better. And then if we have any time for discussion, perhaps you can tell me about the things you're doing that are even better than what we're doing. I would love to learn that. So first, a few touch points. I was at a conference in the spring, the 30th anniversary conference of National Campus Compact. And Andrew Seligson, who's president of Campus Compact, asked this question: what is the purpose of higher education? And he followed the question with one possible approach. Is it to do research or teaching or service? Which is an approach that sort of mirrors the way those of us who are faculty get evaluated, right? We get evaluated on our teaching. If we're at a research institution, our research counts, then we're expected to do some kind of service. And so he said, is that the purpose, to do those things? His answer was no. It's to serve the public good by doing teaching, by doing research, and by doing service. He said all of our institutions are public institutions. Some of us call ourselves publics, you know, the TBR institutions, the institutions overseen by the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. But even the privates have public charters, they depend on public funds. They all are intertwined with public life. And so the justification for our very existence is to serve the public good. So then the question is, how do we do it? Well, I can't talk about that without going back to John Dewey. And 100 years ago, John Dewey wrote an interesting little article called "The Need of an Industrial Education in an Industrial Society." You all probably remember that 100 years ago, the United States was an industrial society. This was before we turned into a post-industrial society. And so he wrote this little article asking the question, what is it an industrial democracy needs in education? And his answer was workforce development. This is actually, he didn't quite use that term, but that's his answer. He says, people need an education that will prepare them to work successfully in the kinds of jobs that the economy offers so that they can live more or less comfortable lives, and so that they can contribute to the creation of an economy that will support all of us. Then he ends the first paragraph, and he says, there are other people who write about this more than me, so I'm going to focus on the second half of my title, Education in an Industrial Democracy. And he asks, what is it that a democracy needs from the people who live in it? And what is the role of education in providing what democracy needs? His approach here is a lot like Nell Center's approach yesterday when she asked us, why does it matter in a democracy that we share a sense of community and civic life? Or Sandy Wetmore's questions today, what is democratic engagement and why should teachers care? You folks are already asking all the right questions. So John Dewey said, well, yeah, workforce alignment, but he also said we need to create a culture of democracy. He said democracy needs qualities in its citizens which, unfortunately, do not grow spontaneously on bushes. Democracy must be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. So I want to offer to all of you the role of midwife. We are democracy's midwives, helping it to be reborn as a potential in the future of this society. Okay, so let's jump forward about 100 years. Nancy Thomas this morning pointed to a crucible moment, and I'll bet Karen McTighe-Musel did that yesterday also. So 4 years ago, this document was released, and if you haven't yet read it, you can find it online at AAC&U's website, aacu.org/crucible, and I commend it to you because it is a very wise document making the case that democracy needs its midwife, and higher ed has a particular responsibility as the midwife of democracy, because we're a place where diverse people come together to learn, to develop, to grow, and to get credentials that will get them jobs that will provide for their futures. But we can take advantage of the fact that we are a forum for meeting so many different people, as we've talked about in the last day and a half. And we can then work to inculcate the qualities that democracy needs. On page 4 of the Crucible Moment, there's a chart, possible learning outcomes for civic learning. And there's a list of things that represent different forms of knowledge. Another list, different kinds of skills. Another list, different values that are critical for democratic practice. And the last list is capacities for collective action. It's a wonderful list. So that's my background for today. So what happened in Massachusetts? First, I'll tell you about the players in this game. There is a Board of Higher Education, which is a group of people who set policy for public higher education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And then there is a Department of Higher Education, which is the government bureaucracy that supports the board and that works directly with the campuses to help them implement the policies that the board has created. And then there are 29 campuses. They're divided into a rather standard trio of kinds of campus. There are community colleges, 15 of those. There are state colleges and state universities. There are 9 of those. And there are 5 campuses of the University of Massachusetts system. About 25 years or so ago, the University of Massachusetts went to the state legislature and said, we're special. We really don't need to be under the direct oversight of the Board of Higher Education. And they got the right ears. And so the legislature more or less cut them loose from the oversight of the Board of Higher Ed. So the Board of Higher Ed has direct oversight over the state colleges and universities and the community colleges. And when it does things like the policy I'm about to talk about, it says, we expect the community colleges and the state universities to do this, and we invite the University of Massachusetts to join us in this initiative. So that's the system. So in 2010, the board rolled out what it called the Vision Project for Massachusetts public higher education. And the tagline for these goals, 5 goals, was, we aim in Massachusetts to prepare the best educated citizenry and workforce in the nation. Sorry, Tennessee, we're going to beat you and the other 48 out. And the goals were things like increasing college attendance, increasing graduation rates, closing achievement gaps, aligning programs with workforce needs, and using assessment as a tool to improve student learning. And some of the campuses looked at that and they said back to the board, okay, we see workforce in here, that's pretty clear, but we don't see citizenry so clearly. So how is it we're going to prepare the best educated citizens in the nation? And the board thought about it and they said, you're right. We need to add, as an explicit goal of our Vision Project, preparing citizens. So it was input from the campuses, from the faculty and the administrators of some of the public campuses that pushed the board to recognize the importance of naming and claiming this critically important mission of preparing citizens. So they added this goal, providing students with the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to be active, informed citizens. And if you're interested in seeing some of the documents that are behind this, this is the website, www.mass.edu/visionproject/preparingcitizens.asp. That'll take you to a whole set of things behind this. Having made this goal, then the board said, we pretty well understand what the metrics are for some of our other goals. You want to increase participation from underrepresented groups, you count and you do the math. You want to increase graduation rates, you count and you do the math. If you want to prepare citizens, what is it exactly you look at? So the board convened a study group of mostly faculty and some staff from the 3 sectors of public higher ed, and some other interested parties like Massachusetts Campus Compact's director, to advise it on, well, what should we be looking for when we are aiming to prepare citizens. And I had the privilege of being part of that study group. We met for quite some time. We did a survey, we got data, we pooled our heads, we created 2 tools, an assessment framework for student learning outcomes, which looks a lot like page 4 of A Crucible Moment. But of course we had to put our fingerprints on the edges. And another assessment tool for assessing institutional readiness for taking on a civic learning goal. And we provided those tools and a set of recommendations back to the board. The board thought about our report for a few months. And then, in 2014, it passed a policy on civic learning. And there are several elements to this policy. One is a definition. Civic learning means the acquisition of the knowledge, the intellectual skills, and the practical skills or applied competencies that citizens need for informed and effective participation in civic and democratic life. Knowledge, intellectual skills, practical skills. And it also means acquiring an understanding of the social and political values that underlie democratic structures and practices. They were very careful with this language, and I need to signal to you how they did this. They said, our recommendation from the study group was a little bit stronger than this language. We said students need to acquire the values of democracy. And they said, you know, we're public education. If certain people see us as setting ourselves up to teach values that we think are the right ones, we're setting ourselves up for a world of pain. So we want to be just a little bit more distant from that goal. And we want to say they should acquire an understanding of those values, social and political values, that underlie democratic structures and practices. Clearly there are values associated with democratic structures and practices. If people are going to be active, effective, and informed participants in civic and democratic life, they will need to be guided by those values to be effective. But we're not going to say we want them all to get those values from us. We're going to say we want them to understand what those values are. And then they can make their own choices as informed citizens. Okay, it still works for me. The board's policy also had this observation. Campuses should think about engendering civic learning through academic coursework, and they said this happens in gen ed courses, this happens in core courses, and this happens in the majors. So all across the curriculum. And they said also through co-curricular activities. That's another domain. And they said, and through engagement with communities beyond the campus. What they didn't say, but to me is the logical fill in the blank right beneath that, is that off-campus engagement needs to be organized either through the curriculum, where it's often called service learning, or through the co-curriculum. So the first 2 places organize the third part. So they said we need civic knowledge, we need civic skills, and we need civic values, or at least we need to understand what they are. And there's a place for civic engagement. And those of us who have been working with this initiative have said, well, that's where you really put it all together, because if the goal is to learn how to participate effectively in civic life, you have to do it to learn how to do it. You can learn really important things just in the classroom, and there's a really big place for that. But if the overall goal is to prepare people as participants in civic life, we also need to be connecting them to civic action beyond the classroom. There were also 4 action steps. 3 of them were for the Department of Higher Ed, and 1 is for the campuses. The one for the campuses said, you should incorporate civic learning into your strategic plans, which the board reviews whenever a campus rewrites its strategic plan. Incorporate this into your strategic plan as an expected outcome for your undergraduates. So the board is saying, really, all your undergraduates should be involved in civic learning, and you need to plan how to do it when you do your planning. And then called upon the Department of Higher Ed to convene the campuses to share best practices, something like you've been doing the last 2 days. And called upon the department, as available, to fund work on civic learning. This requires work with our legislature to get them to put money in our hands to pass on to the campuses. Or it requires work with external funders to get them to put money in our hands to pass on to the campuses. Question and answer time. I can talk about that if you want. The board also said the department should assess the extent and the variety of civic learning on the campuses. And finally, the board said the department should collaborate with K through 12 to coordinate work on civic learning across the sectors. And I'll start by reporting out a little about that. So this happened in 2014. The commissioner of higher ed decided that he actually needed someone to work with the campuses to support this, or the campuses would not be convinced that this was real and that they really needed to do much. And so he created a position of Director of Civic Learning and Engagement and tapped me to take on that position. So I started doing this work in May last year, 2015. So one thing that's happened since May 2015 is the 2 departments, elementary and secondary ed and higher ed, got together. We looked at an agreement that our boards had signed off on in 2013 saying, here's our definition of college and career readiness and how we need to work together to ensure that students coming through public education in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts come up with college and career readiness. And this little task group added a 3rd component, civic preparation. We used the same definition that I've just shared with you of civic learning. And we said, and we need to work to ensure that students are prepared for lives of active and informed citizenship, civic participation. And we presented that back to the boards. They tinkered with it a little and they voted it in. So we are, to my knowledge, the first state in the nation to have adopted a framework committing to civic learning K through 16 in public education. It wasn't actually that hard to get there. What's hard is what follows. You know, once you made the commitment, then what do you do with it? So, one of the places that once I was asked to help with this, that I decided to start was looking at courses that have civic learning as a core component. And there was a team convened before I was hired that recommended that in the course and student data that gets uploaded to the Department of Higher Ed every year from all of the public campuses, and I think y'all do that too. You upload your student data, your course data to TBR or wherever it goes. That in those data, there could be flags on the courses that are civic learning courses. And so I thought, well, okay, let's start with the curriculum. The board said co-curriculum also, but let's do one thing at a time here. Let's start with curriculum. And I thought, I need help figuring out what to say to the campuses about how to designate civic learning courses. So I invited about 30 people from 8 of our campuses to form a civic learning team to advise me on how this should be rolled out, how it would need to work on their own campuses, and how it could be recommended then to all the campuses. And it was a wonderful team. And one of the things we decided was that there should be a substantial focus on at least one of the 4 elements in the board's definition: knowledge, intellectual skills, practical skills, values. I wanted to say, you need all of them. Courses should do all of them. And they said, my team said to me, if you hold that as the criterion, you'll have very few courses. And it's going to be really hard to engage every student in civic learning in any recognizable way. And so we said, we need to have many courses on each campus. We need to have many courses in each student's experience that have a civic learning focus. And then it becomes additive as they move through their career in higher ed. And so they convinced me, okay, a substantial focus on at least one of those 4. Then we said, well, there need to be categories. And we came up with 3, which eventually turned into 5. Folks on the team were very concerned with the relationship between civic learning and civic engagement. And they wanted to be able to capture what their campuses are doing with civic engagement as a way to do civic learning. And so they said, we talked about in the service learning field, one of the fairly well accepted best practices is that you just build it into the course and everyone does it. It's required as a component of what you do to learn the stuff you're learning. And then you can prepare students adequately for their work in the community. You can process it through reflection, writing journals, or I hear maybe that's not the best way to do it, through other forms of processing. And some of our team members said, at our community colleges, some of our champions for service learning are adjunct faculty whose courses disappear if not enough students enroll. And we need them on board. We need them to be able to be counted. And so the strategy we've adopted for them is to have service learning as an option, and if students don't choose to do that option, they don't have to run away from the course and bring the enrollment down below the threshold. They can do some other kind of project of equal weight. And so if they're both civic learning projects, but one is engagement and one is not, then we can count it as a civic learning course with engagement optional. And then there were other folks on the same team from other community colleges who said, yeah, we used to do that, but we've done away with it. And now all of our service learning courses are required. And they went back and forth. And so we ended up saying, we need that category. Civic learning with engagement optional. And then civic learning, just all by itself, without engagement. So those are our 3 core categories that we're asking the campuses to use to identify their courses. And then we said, well, okay, what if they look at a course, they look at the syllabus, they really take a close look at it, and they say, this course meets various goals, but it does not really do civic learning. Then it's not applicable. So we need to NA. And then that recognizes that we have taken a careful look at it and determined that it's not one of the ones that should be counted. And then we said, well, while we're rolling this out, we need a 5th category, not reviewed. And that category will hopefully go away over the next couple of years. That's going to be the default to start with, and then we change from not reviewed to one of the other four. So we rolled out guidance we had a meeting of provosts and faculty and the institutional research people who would be putting this stuff into the data reported to the Department of Higher Ed. And we talked about all of this. They gave us some feedback. Then we rolled out written guidance. And the pilot year is this coming academic year. We have asked all of the campuses to make some identification of civic learning courses this fall, or last spring for this fall, ideally, and many of them got started during the spring. We were careful to say, we think it would be a really good idea for you to tell your students which courses you've identified as civic learning courses with these different classifications. We're not requiring that of you. We're requiring that you tell us. And we're going to be collecting the data and looking at it and tracking and reporting back to the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts what's happening in public higher education around civic learning. Because for you to put these course designations into your registrar's database might require that you go through faculty governance. Depends on how you read it on your campus. You know, it could be complicated in that way. Or you might just decide, yeah, we can do this, and put it up and put it out. That's a local decision. Make that decision how you will. But we need to begin hearing about what you're doing so that we can analyze it and support it. So that is one major activity that we've been working on this year. And one of the opportunities that this work has given me in the position I'm in is campuses will say, we need to think about how to do this. We need to think about how to apply these criteria. Would you come meet with our faculty? And so I've been doing workshops with faculty, talking about it, hearing their questions, and engaging them in discussion like we're going to have in a couple of minutes. So what goes into civic learning with engagement required? We ask people to look at the syllabus. If it's required, every student participates in it. We said it needs to be something that is designed so that there are reciprocal benefits, both to the students and to a broader community beyond the classroom. And there was a good deal of discussion about this. Well, could it be to other people on the campus itself? And we decided, let's go broad with this. They don't have to go off the campus to do civic engagement. They could do an education program or a resource program or some other kind of program that will positively impact the quality of life for other students. And that would be civic engagement in their own campus community. Okay, so it has that. And then there's reflection, where the student reports on, presents, or explains the significance of the experience and also locates it in a broader context. It's social, it's political, it's economic context. I got a call last week from a colleague on one of the community college campuses saying, we're planning our faculty development for the fall. We want to work with our service learning faculty to help them turn their service learning courses into courses that we'll designate as civic learning with engagement required. And we're trying to figure out, well, how would we help them do that second part of your reflection definition? And so we talked for half an hour about, well, let's brainstorm that. It could involve this, it could involve that. And she ended up saying, okay, now I've got some ideas to take back to my committee. And I'm eager to hear what they do. Civic learning with engagement optional would be just the same as this, except that not every student would be required. Civic learning without engagement, the syllabus would link the content of the course to, and the course learning goals to the board's definition of civic learning, and would explain how that works. So, what else are we doing? We're working on rubrics to design tools that faculty can use to assess student learning in the civic domain. And we've looked at AAC&U's Civic Engagement Value Rubric, which identifies a bunch of important things. We've built a draft of a civic knowledge rubric, and we built a draft of a civic values rubric. And if you go to civiclearningrubric.wordpress.com, you can find both of those. And you can also find a place to give feedback if you use the civic knowledge rubric, and we will set up a feedback loop for the civic values rubric as well, because we know they're not perfect. We had a national team work on each of these, and wonderful discussions, and now we've got tools that we want people to test drive, give us feedback on, and we'll revise them using that feedback. I have 3 questions I want to ask you before you look at the next slide. The next slide is going to list some civic values, what we think of as civic values. So, would you agree that these are civic values that underlie civic engagement and participation in democratic structures and practices? And then would you take a moment to pick one that's important to you and think about, how did you learn that value? And then think about, how might you facilitate students developing an understanding of this value? So, do these look to you like civic values? How did you learn at least one of them that you think is important? And how might you facilitate students learning that value? And here's our list, which you can find at that WordPress website. Empathy, open-mindedness, civic negotiation, diversity, human dignity, social justice, and the public good. And we have definitions for these. And we have, like the AAC&U value rubrics, we have 4 categories for student performance with performance descriptors at each level, so that you could look at a piece of student work and you could say, does this demonstrate this particular element, and if so, at what level? And then someone else could look at that same work and ask, does this demonstrate this particular element, and if so, at what level? And then you could see if you agree, so that you could do some norming around authentic assessment of the products of real student work. So if we had another half an hour, we'd have a real lively discussion right now about civic values. But I wanted to give you a chance to at least reflect for a moment on these values. And how do these values connect? This is what we're saying in Massachusetts. Students need to understand. How do these values connect to the discussions we've had for the last day and a half? Okay, to sum up, how can we support civic learning? We can do it through courses across the curriculum, at every level, in every department. Every discipline has a civic dimension. And we can design courses that tap into that civic dimension. We can do it through the co-curriculum. We're not paying attention to that yet in Massachusetts, but it's on my list. We can do it through engagement with communities beyond the campus. And if you have your copy of A Crucible Moment, you can turn to page 15 and you can actually read this next slide. We can create civic-minded campuses that have a civic ethos governing campus life. Nancy Thomas told us some about that this morning. That have civic literacy as a goal for every student. that practice civic inquiry within the majors and within general education, and that set civic action as a goal for lifelong practice. And speaking of civic action, I was going to say something about Campus Compact's civic action plans, which some of your presidents may have signed on to. And if right after this ends, you'd like to talk with me a little about that, I would be happy to encourage you to jump on that boat, whether or not your president has signed on to it. Okay, so we could create civic-minded campuses, and that's really going beyond just locating it in some courses and just doing some cool volunteer service. That's transforming our institutions. And when we move into our panel, I'll be asking you, Chief Academic Officers and TBR Administrator, about how exactly are you going to be helping your campuses do this transformation? Thank you.